The summer of 1914 was glorious. Across Europe, people basked in sunshine, attended garden parties, and enjoyed what seemed like an endless season of peace and prosperity. In London, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, and St. Petersburg, the cafes were full, the theaters were packed, and the future seemed bright with promise. The great empires of Europe had avoided major war for nearly half a century. Trade flourished across borders. Artists, scientists, and intellectuals traveled freely between countries, sharing ideas and innovations. The world had never been more connected, more advanced, or more confident in human civilization. But beneath this brilliant surface, dark currents were flowing. Ancient hatred simmered. Arms races accelerated. Nationalist passions burned hot. Military leaders drew up elaborate war plans. Diplomats wove tangled webs of alliances. And in the Balkans, a region that had already earned the ominous nickname, the powder keg of Europe, forces were gathering that would soon ignite a conflagration beyond anyone's worst nightmares. Within weeks, that glorious summer would transform into something unrecognizable. The world that existed in June 1914 would be gone forever, swept away by a tide of violence, destruction, and death that would claim 17 million lives and wound 20 million more. Empires that had stood for centuries would crumble into dust. Entire generations would be slaughtered in muddy trenches. And when the guns finally fell silent after 4 years of unprecedented carnage, nothing would ever be the same again. This is the story of the First World War. The Great War. The war to end all wars. A conflict that began with an assassination in a city most people had never heard of and ended with the map of the world redrawn, the old order destroyed, and the seeds planted for even greater horrors to come. This is the story of how the modern world was forged in blood, mud, and fire. This is the story of the war that changed everything. Part 1. The World Before the Storm. To understand how the First World War happened, we need to understand the world as it existed in the early 20th century. Europe in 1914 was dominated by 5 great powers, each controlling vast territories, commanding enormous military forces, and pursuing its own ambitions on the world stage. These powers had created a complex system of rivalries, alliances, and competing interests that would ultimately prove catastrophically unstable. Great Britain stood at the apex of global power. The British Empire stretched across a quarter of the Earth's land surface, encompassing Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, large portions of Africa, and strategic positions throughout the world. British ships carried trade to every port. British banks financed projects on every continent. The British Royal Navy, by far the largest and most powerful naval force in the world, enforced what the British called Pax Britannica, British peace, across the world's oceans. London was the undisputed financial capital of the world. English was rapidly becoming a language of international commerce and diplomacy. But Britain's dominant position was being challenged. The British faced growing competition from rising industrial powers, particularly from Germany. British political leaders worried constantly about maintaining their empire and protecting their naval supremacy. They feared any European power becoming strong enough to dominate the continent, which could then threaten British interests globally. This fear would heavily influence British foreign policy and ultimately draw Britain into the coming war. Across the English Channel, France nursed old wounds and harbored bitter resentments. The French remembered their defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, a humiliating conflict that had ended with German troops marching through Paris and Germany taking the French provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. These lost provinces remained a source of intense national pain for France. French schoolchildren learned to point at maps showing Alsace-Lorraine shaded differently, representing lost French territory. French military planning obsessed over how to recover these provinces and avenge the defeat of 1870. France in 1914 possessed a large army, a growing industrial base, and a reviving national confidence. But the French remained haunted by demographic concerns. France's population had grown much more slowly than Germany's, meaning that France would always be at a numerical disadvantage in any future war. This demographic reality pushed France toward seeking powerful allies who could help balance German strength. French diplomats worked tirelessly to forge alliances that would encircle Germany and prevent German domination of Europe. Germany, unified only in 1871 under Prussian leadership, had rapidly become Europe's most dynamic power. German industry, science, and education had advanced with breathtaking speed. German universities led the world in chemistry, physics, and medicine. German factories produced steel, chemicals, and machinery in quantities that challenged even Britain's industrial might. German cities grew enormous, filled with modern infrastructure and bustling with energy and ambition. But Germany's rapid rise created its own problems. Kaiser Wilhelm II, who became emperor in 1888, was an insecure, erratic, and bellicose ruler who dismissed the cautious diplomacy of his grandfather's longtime chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. Wilhelm wanted Germany to have its place in the sun, a global empire and international prestige to match its economic power. He began building a large navy to challenge British maritime supremacy, an action that alarmed Britain and pushed the British toward alliance with France. Germany felt encircled by potential enemies. To the west lay France, seeking revenge for 1870. To the east stretched Russia, with its vast population and growing military strength. German military planners developed elaborate scenarios for fighting a two-front war, believing that Germany's survival depended on being able to defeat France quickly before Russia's enormous armies could fully mobilize. This belief in the necessity of fighting a quick, decisive war would prove catastrophic when war actually came. Austria-Hungary was an empire living on borrowed time. The Habsburg dynasty had ruled Central Europe for centuries, but by 1914, their multinational empire was increasingly unstable. Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Romanians, Croats, Serbs, Slovenes, and Italians all lived within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, each group with its own language, culture, and often its own nationalist aspirations. The empire held together through imperial tradition, bureaucratic efficiency, and the loyalty of its army, but nationalist movements threatened to tear it apart. Austria-Hungary's particular nightmare was Slavic nationalism. Millions of Slavs lived within the empire, and many of them looked to Serbia, an independent Slavic nation just across the border, as a potential liberator. Serbian nationalists dreamed of creating a greater Serbia, or a unified, South Slavic state that would unite all the region's Slavic peoples. Such a state would necessarily require breaking up Austria-Hungary. The Austro-Hungarian leadership viewed Serbia with deep suspicion and hostility, seeing it as an existential threat to the empire's survival. Russia was the giant of the East. The Russian Empire stretched across 11 time zones, from Poland in the west to the Pacific Ocean in the east, encompassing an enormous variety of peoples, languages, and religions. Tsar Nicholas II ruled as an autocrat, claiming to derive his authority directly from God. But Russian autocracy was under severe strain. Russia had suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of Japan in 1905, a war that revealed the weakness and incompetence of the Tsarist regime. Revolution had broken out in 1905, forcing the Tsar to make limited concessions, including establishing a parliament called the Duma. Russia in 1914 was industrializing rapidly, but remained primarily an agricultural society. Russian factories grew in number, Russian cities expanded, and Russian railways spread across the vast landscape. But Russia still lagged far behind Western Europe in economic development, education, and technological sophistication. The Russian army was enormous. No European power could match Russian manpower, but Russian soldiers were poorly trained, poorly equipped, and poorly led. Russia's military performance in any future war would prove tragically inadequate. Beyond these five great powers, other nations played important supporting roles in the coming drama. Italy, unified like Germany in the 19th century, sought to establish itself as a major power, but lacked the resources and military strength of the true great powers. The Ottoman Empire, once a mighty force that had threatened Vienna itself, was now the sick man of Europe, losing territories year by year and struggling to modernize its government and military. These nations had organized themselves into two major alliance systems. The Triple Alliance, formed in 1882, linked Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy in a defensive pact. The terms of the alliance required each nation to come to the aid of the others if they were attacked. In practice, Germany was by far the strongest member of this alliance, and German interests dominated the partnership. Italy's commitment was always questionable. The Italians had territorial disputes with Austria-Hungary and maintained good relations with France. Opposing the Triple Alliance was the Triple Entente, a looser arrangement linking France, Russia, and Great Britain. This alliance had developed gradually. France and Russia had signed an alliance in 1894, driven by mutual fear of Germany. Britain had signed an Entente Cordiale with France in 1904, settling colonial disputes and establishing a framework for cooperation. Britain then signed a similar agreement with Russia in 1907. The Triple Entente was less formal than the Triple Alliance. Britain had no explicit obligation to fight for France or Russia. But the diplomatic, military, and strategic ties between these three powers meant that if war came, they would likely fight together. These alliance systems were supposed to prevent war through deterrence. The theory was that no nation would dare start a war if it knew that doing so would immediately bring powerful allies rushing to its enemy's defense. In reality, these alliances would ensure that when war did come, it would immediately become a general European war rather than a localized conflict. The alliances transformed what might have been a limited war between Austria-Hungary and Serbia into a catastrophe that engulfed the entire continent. Beneath the formal diplomacy and alliance systems, deeper forces were pushing Europe toward war. Nationalism had become the dominant political ideology of the age. Across Europe, people increasingly identified themselves primarily by their nationality rather than by their religion, their social class, or their loyalty to a dynasty. Nationalist movements demanded that each nationality should have its own independent state. This was fine when applied to relatively homogeneous populations, but in regions like the Balkans or Austria-Hungary, where multiple nationalities lived intermixed, nationalism was inherently destabilizing and violent. Arms races accelerated as each power sought to maintain its security through military strength. Germany's decision to build a large navy triggered a frantic British response, with each side building larger and more powerful battleships in a competition that consumed enormous resources, but made neither side more secure. On land, every major power maintained huge standing armies and stockpiled weapons on an unprecedented scale. Military spending consumed increasing percentages of national budgets. Military leaders gained increasing influence in government decisions. Social Darwinism, the misapplication of Darwin's evolutionary theories to human societies, convinced many Europeans that conflict between nations was natural, inevitable, and even beneficial. War was seen as a test of national fitness, a crucible that would purify and strengthen the nation. Many military leaders and civilian politicians believed that their nation needed war to prove its vitality and greatness. This ideology made war seem not just acceptable, but actually desirable. The specific spark that would ignite this volatile mixture was smoldering in the Balkans, that powder keg of Europe where nationalist passions burned hottest and where great power interests clashed most directly. Part 2. The Assassination. The city of Sarajevo in June 1914 was a beautiful but tense place. The capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which Austria-Hungary had annexed in 1908, Sarajevo was home to a mixed population of Orthodox Serbs, Catholic Croats, Muslims, and Jews. The city sat at the crossroads of civilizations, where the Christian West met the Islamic East, where the Habsburg Empire bordered the Ottoman sphere of influence. Its architecture reflected this mixture. Orthodox churches, Catholic cathedrals, and Ottoman mosques stood within sight of each other. But Sarajevo in 1914 was also a city simmering with political tension. Many of the city's Serbian inhabitants resented Austrian rule and dreamed of union with Serbia, the independent Slavic kingdom just across the border. Secret nationalist organizations flourished, plotting revolution and assassination. The most radical of these groups was the Black Hand, a secret society of Serbian nationalists who believed that violence was justified in the struggle for South Slavic liberation and unity. Into this volatile situation came Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Franz Ferdinand was scheduled to visit Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, to observe military maneuvers. The date was particularly provocative. June 28th was Vidovdan, or St. Vitus Day, a holiday commemorating the Serbian defeat at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, a battle that held deep significance in Serbian historical memory and nationalist mythology. For Serbian nationalists, Franz Ferdinand's visit on this date was an intentional insult, a demonstration of Austrian domination. Franz Ferdinand himself was a complicated figure. He was not particularly beloved in Austria. He was seen as stiff, difficult, and politically rigid. He had angered Emperor Franz Joseph by insisting on marrying Sophie Chotek, a Czech aristocrat who was considered below the Archduke's station. As a result of this morganatic marriage, Sophie was denied royal honors, and their children were excluded from the line of succession. Franz Ferdinand harbored resentments about this treatment of his wife, and he insisted that she accompany him on his official visits, giving her the recognition that protocol denied her in Vienna. Politically, Franz Ferdinand held views that alarmed both Austrian German nationalists and Hungarian leaders. He contemplated restructuring the empire to give greater autonomy to Slavic populations, potentially creating a trialism that would place Slavs on equal footing with Germans and Hungarians. If implemented, such reforms might have reduced South Slavic nationalism by giving these populations a stake in the empire's survival. But Franz Ferdinand never got the chance to implement his ideas. The Black Hand learned of Franz Ferdinand's planned visit and saw an opportunity. They recruited 6 young assassins, all Bosnian Serbs, most of them students, all of them suffering from tuberculosis and not expecting to live long. The Black Hand provided these young men with weapons, pistols, and bombs, and smuggled them back into Bosnia from Serbia. The assassins were instructed to station themselves along the Archduke's planned route through Sarajevo and kill him. On the morning of June 28th, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie arrived in Sarajevo by train. They were driven in an open car along the Apple Quay beside the Miljaska River, heading toward the city hall for an official reception. The Archduke and his wife sat in the back seat, clearly visible. Security was surprisingly light. Only about 120 policemen were assigned to protect the Archduke along his entire route through the city. The 6 assassins spread out along the route, each waiting for his chance. The first 2 lost their nerve and did nothing as the Archduke's car passed. The third assassin, Nedeljko Vabranovaj, threw his bomb at the Archduke's car. Franz Ferdinand, seeing the bomb coming, raised his arm to deflect it. The bomb bounced off the folded-back roof of the car, fell into the street and exploded under the following vehicle, wounding about 20 people. Vabernovaya swallowed his cyanide pill, which was old and weak, and jumped into the river, which at that point was only about 4 inches deep. He was quickly captured. The Archduke's driver accelerated, speeding past the remaining assassins before they could react. Franz Ferdinand had survived the attempt on his life. The Archduke proceeded to the City Hall reception, where he angrily berated the mayor about the attempt on his life. But he composed himself, gave his planned speech, and then insisted on visiting the wounded from the bombing at the hospital. Incredibly, despite having just survived one assassination attempt, Franz Ferdinand decided to continue with his schedule, though he did agree to a change in route to avoid the city center. Here is where confusion and miscommunication would prove fatal. The new route was supposedly communicated to the drivers, but Franz Ferdinand's driver either didn't receive the message or forgot it. Instead of continuing straight along the Appel Quay to the hospital, the driver turned right onto Franz Joseph Street, the original route it was supposed to have been avoided. Standing on Franz Joseph Street, having given up on the assassination after the Archduke's car sped past him earlier, was 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip, one of the conspirators. Princip was by the Moritz Schiller delicatessen, possibly buying a sandwich, depending on which account you believe. When he heard that the Archduke's car had turned onto his street, he could hardly believe his luck. The Archduke's driver, realizing his mistake, stopped the car and began to reverse. The car stalled directly in front of Princip, just 5 feet away. Princip stepped forward, drew his FN Model 1910 pistol, and fired 2 shots from point-blank range. The first bullet struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck, severing his jugular vein. The second bullet hit Sophie in the abdomen. Franz Ferdinand remained conscious for a few moments. His first words were to his wife, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children." Sophie had already lost consciousness and died almost immediately. Franz Ferdinand died about 10 minutes later. Princip tried to turn his pistol on himself, but was tackled by bystanders before he could fire. He swallowed his cyanide pill, but like his co-conspirators, it was too weak and only made him vomit. He was beaten by the crowd and then taken into custody. Because Princip was 19 years old, just under the age of 20 at which he could receive the death penalty under Austro-Hungarian law, he would be sentenced to 20 years in prison. He would die of tuberculosis in April 1918, just months before the end of the war his actions had triggered. The assassination sent shockwaves through Europe, but initially, many observers believed the crisis could be contained. Assassinations were not uncommon. Anarchists and revolutionaries had killed numerous political leaders in recent decades, including President McKinley of the United States, Juan Gomberto, the First of Italy, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, President Carnot of France, and Prime Minister Canovas of Spain. Each of these assassinations had caused outrage, but had not triggered international war. Why should this one be different? The answer lay in the specific political circumstances of 1914 and in the decisions that key leaders would make in the month following the assassination, a period historians call the July Crisis. Part 3. The July Crisis. The month following the assassination was perhaps the most important month of the 20th century. During this period, European leaders made a series of decisions that would lead to the outbreak of general war. With hindsight, we can see moments when different choices might have prevented catastrophe. But the leaders of 1914 did not have the benefit of hindsight. They made decisions based on their own perceptions of their national interests, their honor, and their security. And step by step, often with the best of intentions, they stumbled into disaster. Austria-Hungary's reaction to the assassination was shaped by several factors. The Austrian leadership believed, correctly, that elements within Serbia had been involved in the assassination plot. The Black Hand, while not officially part of the Serbian government, had connections to Serbian military intelligence. The weapons used in the assassination had come from Serbian military arsenals. Some Serbian officials had known about the plot and had made a vague, half-hearted attempt to warn Austria, but they had not provided enough information to prevent the attack. More broadly, the Austrian leadership saw the assassination as the culmination of years of Serbian agitation and provocation. They believed that Serbia was actively working to undermine Austria-Hungary by encouraging nationalist movements among the empire's South Slavic populations. From the Austrian perspective, Serbia was an existential threat that needed to be eliminated or at least severely weakened. The assassination provided the perfect justification for decisive action. But Austria-Hungary could not move against Serbia without first ensuring German support. If Austria attacked Serbia, Russia might come to Serbia's defense. Austria could not fight Russia without German help. So the Austrian leadership sent a mission to Berlin to consult with Kaiser Wilhelm II and his advisors. On July 5, 1914, Kaiser Wilhelm gave Austria-Hungary what historians call the blank check. Meeting with Austrian representatives, Wilhelm assured them that Germany would stand by Austria-Hungary, whatever action Austria decided to take against Serbia. This was one of the most fateful decisions of the crisis. Wilhelm's pledge encouraged Austrian hawks who wanted war with Serbia and discouraged those who urged caution. Wilhelm's decision has been much debated. Some historians argue that he genuinely believed Austria needed German support to maintain its position as a great power. Others suggest he didn't take the crisis seriously enough. He departed on his regular North Sea cruise shortly after giving Austria his support. Some believe Wilhelm and his advisors saw an opportunity to fight a limited war while conditions favored the Central Powers before Russia completed its military modernization program. Whatever his reasoning, Wilhelm's blank check made war much more likely. Austria-Hungary spent most of July preparing an ultimatum to Serbia, a list of demands that Serbia would almost certainly reject, providing justification for war. The ultimatum was deliberately delayed. Austria wanted to wait until French President Poincaré finished a state visit to Russia, so that France and Russia couldn't immediately coordinate their response. On July 23, 1914, nearly a month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary presented its ultimatum to Serbia. The document contained 10 demands, several of which were intentionally unacceptable. Serbia was required to suppress all anti-Austrian publications and organizations, remove officials that Austria-Hungary deemed objectionable from government service, allow Austro-Hungarian officials to participate directly in the investigation of the assassination on Serbian soil, and more. The ultimatum gave Serbia just 48 hours to respond. The ultimatum was designed to be rejected. As one Austrian official put it, "We have set the ultimatum in such a way that no nation that still possessed self-respect and dignity could possibly accept it." The goal was not to resolve the crisis through diplomacy, but to create a legal justification for war. To the surprise of many, Serbia accepted 9 of the 10 demands and offered to negotiate the 10th through international arbitration. The Serbian response was remarkably conciliatory, considering how humiliating the ultimatum was. Several European leaders, including Kaiser Wilhelm, thought Serbia's response provided a basis for resolving the crisis peacefully. But Austria-Hungary had already decided on war. On July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia and began bombarding Belgrade. The countdown to general European war had begun. Russia faced a crucial decision. As the largest Slavic nation and a traditional protector of Orthodox Christianity, Russia could not stand by and watch Austria-Hungary crush Serbia without sacrificing its prestige and credibility, particularly in the Balkans, where Russian influence was paramount. Tsar Nicholas II and his advisors decided that Russia must support Serbia. But Russian military planning created an enormous problem. Russian mobilization was cumbersome and slow, requiring weeks to transport troops from across the vast empire to the frontiers. Russian generals insisted that partial mobilizing only against Austria-Hungary while remaining at peace with Germany was impossible. Russian war plans called for full mobilization of the entire army or nothing. Partial mobilization would, they argued, throw Russian military planning into chaos and leave Russia vulnerable. On July 30th, 1914, despite understanding that this decision might bring on general war, Tsar Nicholas II ordered full Russian mobilization. This decision has been heavily criticized. Nicholas seems to have believed that mobilization was not necessarily equivalent to war, that he was simply taking precautions. But in the military thinking of 1914, mobilization was the last step before war. Once millions of men began moving toward the frontiers, tremendous pressure developed to actually use those forces before the enemy could complete its own mobilization. Germany now faced its nightmare scenario: war on two fronts. The German military had long prepared for this contingency. The Schlieffen Plan, named after its architect Count Alfred von Schlieffen, called for Germany to quickly defeat France in the west before Russia could fully mobilize its forces in the east. Speed was essential. The plan required throwing nearly all of Germany's military strength against France, overwhelming French defenses through sheer force and rapid movement, capturing Paris and forcing French surrender, all within about 6 weeks. Then, with France defeated, German forces would transfer to the Eastern Front to face Russia. The Schlieffen Plan had one enormous problem. It required German forces to invade France through Belgium. Belgium was neutral, its neutrality guaranteed by international treaty. Violating Belgian neutrality would bring Britain into the war, as Britain was committed to defending Belgian neutrality. But the Schlieffen Plan's architects believed that the violation of Belgium was militarily necessary, and that Britain might not actually honor its commitment to Belgium when it came down to it. On July 31st, Germany issued Russia an ultimatum: cease mobilization within 12 hours or face war. Russia did not respond. On August 1st, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. Germany also issued an ultimatum to France, demanding that France declare its neutrality in a Russo-German war and hand over 2 fortresses to Germany as a guarantee of that neutrality. France refused. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. The Schlieffen Plan was now in motion. German forces began their invasion of Belgium on August 3rd. Belgium, despite being vastly outnumbered, refused German demands for free passage and resisted the invasion. King Albert I of Belgium made an eloquent appeal to Britain and France to honor their treaty obligations to defend Belgian neutrality. Britain faced perhaps the most difficult decision of any power during the July crisis. Britain had no formal alliance requiring it to enter the war. The Triple Entente was not a binding military alliance like the Triple Alliance. Britain could theoretically have remained neutral. Indeed, the British cabinet was divided on whether to enter the war, with several ministers threatening to resign rather than support British intervention. But several factors pushed Britain toward war. Britain had moral and legal obligations to defend Belgian neutrality. British public opinion was outraged by German violation of Belgian neutrality and reports of German atrocities against Belgian civilians. Strategically, Britain could not allow Germany to dominate the entire European continent, as German control of French and Belgian ports would directly threaten British security. And Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey and others argued that Britain's credibility and honor required standing by France and Russia. On August 4, 1914, Britain issued Germany an ultimatum: cease the invasion of Belgium or face war. Germany did not respond. At 11 p.m. London time on August 4, 1914, Britain and Germany were at war. In the space of 1 week, What had begun as a dispute between Austria-Hungary and Serbia had escalated into a general European war involving all the great powers. The alliance system and interlocking mobilization plans had transformed a regional conflict into a continental catastrophe. And this catastrophe would soon spread far beyond Europe, engulfing the entire world. Sir Edward Grey, Britain's Foreign Secretary, stood at the window of his office in London as the street lamps were being lit on the evening of August 3rd. He made a prophetic statement to a friend. The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime. He was right. The world that existed before August 1914 was gone forever. A new, darker age had begun. Part 4. The Rush to War. The mood across Europe as war broke out was, paradoxically, one of excitement and even joy. In cities across the continent, crowds gathered to cheer the declarations of war. Young men rushed to enlist, afraid the war would be over before they could participate. Newspapers published patriotic editorials. Politicians gave rousing speeches. Flowers were placed in the rifle barrels of departing soldiers. In Vienna, Berlin, Paris, London, and St. Petersburg, enormous crowds demonstrated their support for war. This enthusiasm seems bizarre to modern observers who know what the war would become. But the people of 1914 had no way of knowing what awaited them. Their understanding of war was shaped by the relatively limited conflicts of the 19th century. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71 had lasted less than a year. The wars that had unified both Germany and Italy had been brief and decisive. Colonial wars against non-European peoples had typically involved small numbers of European casualties. Even the Russo-Japanese War of 1904–05, the most recent major conflict between industrialized nations, had been fought far from Europe and had not deeply affected European consciousness. Military theorists and popular writers had predicted that modern warfare, with its powerful weapons and rapid transportation, would make war shorter and more decisive than ever before. The destructive power of modern artillery and machine guns was so great, they argued, that armies would quickly destroy each other, making long wars economically and socially impossible. No modern economy could sustain the enormous costs of prolonged warfare between industrialized nations. Therefore, people reasoned, the war would necessarily be short. This logic seemed sound, but would prove catastrophically wrong. The very destructive power of modern weapons that was supposed to make war short would instead create stalemate. Neither side could advance in the face of machine guns and artillery, but neither side could be completely destroyed either. The result would be grinding attrition, a war of exhaustion that would last far longer than anyone imagined possible. But in August 1914, no one anticipated this. The common belief was that the war would be over by Christmas. Soldiers departed for the front with flowers in their rifles and songs on their lips. They expected glory, adventure, and a quick victory. What they found instead was mud, blood, and death on an industrial scale. The enthusiasm for war also reflected the power of nationalist ideology. For decades, nationalist movements had taught Europeans to identify primarily with their nation and to view other nations as competitors or enemies. School curricula emphasized national history and national glory. Military service was presented as the highest duty of citizenship. Honor, courage, and willingness to sacrifice for the nation were promoted as the supreme virtues. Nationalist propaganda had also created crude stereotypes of other nations. Germans were portrayed as militaristic and brutal. The French were supposedly frivolous and decadent. The British were seen as hypocritical and greedy. Russians were viewed as backward and barbaric. These stereotypes made it easier to hate the enemy and harder to sympathize with enemy suffering. Many young men also saw war as a test of their manhood, a chance to prove themselves and escape the tedium of civilian life. The poet Rupert Brooke, who would die during the war, expressed this sentiment in his poetry, thanking God for matching his generation with this hour. War seemed romantic, heroic, and meaningful in ways that ordinary peacetime existence did not. There were, of course, dissenters. Socialists and pacifists opposed the war, arguing that workers had no quarrel with each other, and that this was a capitalist war fought for the profit of the ruling classes. Some intellectuals warned of the catastrophe ahead, but these voices were drowned out by the overwhelming tide of nationalist fervor. Those who opposed the war were branded as traitors and cowards. The German army that marched west in August 1914 numbered over 1 million men, the largest field force ever assembled. They moved according to the elaborate timetables of the Schlieffen Plan, crossing into Belgium on August 3rd and advancing rapidly toward France. The German High Command expected Belgian resistance to collapse quickly, allowing German forces to sweep through Belgium in a matter of days before wheeling south into France. The German army that marched west in August 1914 numbered over 1 million men, the largest field force ever assembled. They moved according to the elaborate timetables of the Schlieffen Plan, crossing into Belgium on August 3rd and advancing rapidly toward France. The German High Command expected Belgian resistance to collapse quickly, allowing German forces to sweep through Belgium in a matter of days before wheeling south into France. But Belgian resistance proved fiercer than anticipated. The fortress city of Liege, guarded by a ring of modern concrete and steel forts, held out for 12 days despite bombardment by massive German siege guns. These guns, including the infamous Big Bertha 420mm howitzer, fired shells weighing over 1 ton that could pulverize concrete fortifications. The sound of these guns firing could be heard over 100 miles away. Despite their power, it took nearly 2 weeks to reduce Liege's forts. Belgian civilians also resisted, with some civilians taking up arms against the invaders. German forces responded with harsh reprisals. Towns were burned. Civilians were executed. The university city of Louvain was deliberately destroyed, with its famous medieval library burned. These atrocities, whether exaggerated or not by Allied propaganda, outraged international opinion and helped cement Germany's image as a brutal aggressor. The German advance, though delayed, eventually overcame Belgian resistance and pushed into northern France. By late August, German forces were deep into French territory, driving before them French armies that had been caught off guard by the speed and power of the German offensive. The French army had its own plan, known as Plan 17, which called for immediate offensive action to recover Alsace and Lorraine. French military doctrine emphasized the offensive à outrance, the attack to the utmost. French theorists believed that morale and the attacking spirit could overcome material obstacles. This doctrine was symbolized by the French army's uniforms, which included bright red trousers that made soldiers clearly visible on the battlefield. French generals argued that concealment was cowardly, and that brave men should attack in the open, relying on their superior morale to carry them through. This doctrine was disastrously wrong. When French armies attacked into Alsace and Lorraine in August 1914, they were cut down by German machine gun and artillery fire. French soldiers in their bright uniforms made perfect targets. The French offensives failed with horrific casualties. In the month of August 1914 alone, the French army suffered over 260,000 casualties, including approximately 75,000 dead more. French soldiers died in August 1914 than in any other month of the entire war. By early September, the situation looked desperate for France. German armies were approaching Paris from the north and east. The French government evacuated to Bordeaux. The fall of Paris seemed imminent, which would likely mean French defeat and the end of the war in the West within weeks, just as the Schlieffen Plan had envisioned. But the Schlieffen Plan was beginning to break down. The rapid German advance had outrun its supply lines. German soldiers, who had been marching for weeks under the hot August sun carrying heavy packs, were exhausted. Horses, which provided most of the German army's transport, were dying by the thousands from overwork. Communication between German field armies became difficult. Coordination began to break down. German commanders also made critical mistakes. The original Schlieffen Plan called for the German right wing, the forces sweeping through Belgium and northern France, to be overwhelmingly strong enough to envelop Paris from the west. But the German Chief of Staff, Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, had weakened the right wing to strengthen other sectors. The result was that the German armies didn't have quite enough strength to complete the great wheeling movement the plan called for. The British Expeditionary Force, a small but professional army, had crossed the Channel and taken position on the French left flank. Though heavily outnumbered, the British soldiers fought skillfully, their rapid rifle fire so effective that Germans sometimes believed they faced machine guns rather than rifles. The British didn't stop the German advance, but they slowed it down and inflicted disproportionate casualties. French General Joseph Joffre, the commander-in-chief, saw an opportunity. If he could strike at the exposed German flank, he might halt the advance or even turn it into a rout. Joffre ordered a general counterattack all along the front. The First Battle of the Marne, fought September 6th to 12th, 1914, became one of history's decisive encounters. The battle raged across a front extending over 200 miles, involving nearly 2 million men. Communications were primitive. Commanders often had little idea what was happening even a few miles away. The fog of war was literal and metaphorical. But gradually, German commanders realized their advance had stalled. Their troops were exhausted. Supply problems were becoming critical. The French and British resistance was fiercer than expected. In one of the war's most famous episodes, the French commandeered over 600 Parisian taxicabs to rush 6,000 reserve troops to the front. The Taxis of the Marne became legendary, though their actual military impact was modest. What mattered more was that French and British forces were holding and even counterattacking in some sectors. On September 9th, German commanders made the fateful decision to retreat. The Schlieffen Plan had failed. France had survived. The war would not be over by Christmas. German forces fell back to the Aisne River and dug in. What followed would define the character of the war for the next 4 years. Both sides now attempted to outflank each other in a series of movements known as the Race to the Sea. Each army tried to get around the northern end of the enemy's line, only to find the enemy doing the same thing. The attempts to find an open flank continued through September and October, extending northward through Picardy and Flanders until both sides reached the English Channel coast. By November 1914, the front line extended from the Swiss border to the North Sea, a distance of over 400 miles. There were no more flanks to turn. Both sides had arrived at a stalemate, and when soldiers cannot advance, they dig in to protect themselves. Thus was born the Western Front, a continuous line of trenches that would barely move for 3 years. The trenches started as simple affairs, just ditches scraped into the earth to provide cover from enemy fire. But as it became clear the war would not be short, both sides developed elaborate trench systems. A typical trench network consisted of 3 parallel lines. The front line trench, where soldiers stood watch and from which attacks were launched. A support trench several hundred yards behind, where reserves waited. And a reserve trench further back. These parallel trenches were connected by communication trenches running perpendicular to the front. The whole system resembled a ladder when viewed from above. Front-line trenches were typically about 7 feet deep and 6 feet wide, with a firing step allowing soldiers to shoot over the parapet. The front of the trench facing the enemy was protected by sandbags. Behind the front line was the parados, protecting against fire from the rear. Dugouts, underground chambers carved into the trench walls, or deeper into the earth, provided shelter from artillery bombardment and a place to sleep. German dugouts were often elaborate, some reaching 30 feet underground with electric lighting, multiple rooms, and relative comfort. French and British dugouts were generally more primitive. Between the opposing trench lines lay no man's land, a devastated wasteland ranging from a few dozen yards to several hundred yards wide. No man's land was a hellscape of shell craters, mud, destroyed vegetation, and the bodies of the dead, both recent and rotting. It was covered with barbed wire entanglements, sometimes in belts 20 yards or more deep, designed to slow attacking infantry and make them easier targets. Occasionally, no man's land contained the ruins of villages or farms that had been on the front line when fighting ceased. Life in the trenches was miserable beyond what civilians could imagine. The trenches were always damp, often flooded with several inches or even feet of water and mud. In wet weather, the sides of trenches collapsed. Walking through deep mud was exhausting. Soldiers developed trench foot, a condition where feet, constantly wet and cold, began to rot. Flesh would die and turn black. If caught early, trench foot could be treated by warming and drying the feet. If ignored, amputation might be necessary. Commanders inspected their men's feet regularly and could court-martial soldiers for neglecting foot care, so serious was the problem. Rats infested the trenches. These were not ordinary rats, but massive creatures, some as large as cats, fattened on the abundant food supply of corpses and discarded rations. Soldiers reported rats running over their faces at night. The rats spread disease and contaminated food. Shooting them was pointless. More always came. Lice were another constant torment. Every soldier had lice. They lived in the seams of uniforms and came out to feed on blood, causing constant itching. Soldiers would spend hours picking lice from their clothes and crushing them between their fingernails, but the effort was futile. The lice always returned. Lice spread trench fever, a debilitating disease that caused high fever, severe headaches, and leg pain. Then there were the flies, especially in warm weather when corpses decomposed. Clouds of flies swarmed over the trenches and no man's land, crawling on food, getting into mouths and eyes. The smell was overpowering, a mixture of human waste, rotting bodies, poison gas residue, and the earthy smell of disturbed soil. The food was monotonous and often barely edible. British soldiers subsisted mainly on bully beef, hard biscuits, and tea. French soldiers had their wine ration at least. German soldiers ate black bread, sausage, and turnips, especially as the British blockade tightened. All sides occasionally received hot food brought up from field kitchens behind the lines, but more often soldiers ate cold tinned rations. The daily routine was exhausting and nerve-wracking. Soldiers rotated between frontline duty, support positions, and rest areas behind the lines, typically spending a few days to a week in each position. At the front line, the day began with stand to at dawn, when all soldiers manned the firing step in case the enemy attacked at first light. After stand to, soldiers performed various duties, repairing the trench walls, filling sandbags, pumping out water, cleaning weapons, and the endless task of improving defenses. Patrols ventured into no man's land at night to repair barbed wire, gather intelligence about enemy positions, or capture prisoners for interrogation. These patrols were terrifying. Men crawled through the darkness and shell-torn ground, trying to remain silent while navigating by memory and compass, always aware that the enemy had machine guns trained on no man's land and would fire at any sound. But the worst ordeal was artillery bombardment. Both sides possessed artillery in quantities never before imagined. German guns, British guns, French guns all hurled high explosive shrapnel and poison gas shells at enemy trenches, hour after hour, day after day. A soldier under bombardment could do nothing but huddle in his dugout and hope that no shell would score a direct hit. The noise was indescribable, a continuous rolling thunder that went on so long it became almost a physical presence. Men shouted to each other and couldn't hear their own voices. The ground shook continuously. Shells screamed as they fell, then exploded in ear-splitting blasts, throwing up geysers of earth and steel fragments. Direct hits obliterated men, leaving nothing but a crater and perhaps a few unidentifiable fragments. Near misses buried men alive or blew them to pieces. The psychological impact was even worse than the physical casualties. Shell shock, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, affected hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Men developed uncontrollable shaking, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't function. Some went catatonic. Some went mad. Military authorities initially treated shell shock as cowardice, court-martialing, and even executing soldiers who broke down. Only gradually did medical understanding develop that these men were suffering from genuine psychological trauma. Yet amidst all this horror, soldiers found ways to maintain their humanity and even their sense of humor. They shared cigarettes, told jokes, looked at photographs of wives and children, wrote letters home. They formed bonds of comradeship that survivors would remember as the most intense relationships of their lives. Men who lived through the trenches often said that despite the horrors, they had never felt closer to other human beings than they did to their fellow soldiers in those terrible days. There were even moments of beauty. Soldiers wrote poems, sketched pictures, and sang songs. Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and other poets would create some of the finest war literature ever written, capturing both the horror and the strange beauty of war. Soldiers remembered sunrises over the torn landscape, the brief glimpse of a bird singing despite the gunfire, moments of quiet when the killing stopped and peace seemed possible again. And there was the remarkable Christmas truce of 1914. On Christmas Eve, along portions of the Western Front, German soldiers began singing Christmas carols. British soldiers responded with their own carols. Then, incredibly, men from both sides climbed out of their trenches and met in no man's land. They shook hands, exchanged gifts, showed photographs of their families. Some units played football. Men who hours before had been trying to kill each other now stood together, sharing the holiday. The Christmas truce was not universal. Many sectors continued fighting. High command on both sides was horrified and strictly forbade any fraternization. Similar truces were attempted in later years, but were quickly suppressed. Yet for those who participated, the Christmas truce remained proof that even in war's darkest hour, human decency could prevail. German and British soldiers discovered they had more in common with each other than with the generals and politicians who commanded them. This realization was dangerous to those in power, which is why fraternization was so ruthlessly suppressed thereafter. As 1914 ended and 1915 began, both sides realized they faced a problem no one had anticipated: how to break the trench deadlock. The trenches gave every advantage to the defender. An attacking force had to climb out of their trench and cross no man's land, making them vulnerable to machine gun fire and artillery. Barbed wire slowed their advance. Even if attackers reached enemy trenches, defenders could retreat to their support trenches and counterattack, often retaking lost ground. The mathematics were brutal. For every mile of front, defenders needed relatively few soldiers to hold the line. But attackers needed massive numerical superiority to have any chance of success. And even with numerical superiority, geography favored defense. Machine guns, which could fire hundreds of rounds per minute, mowed down advancing infantry. Artillery, which could be accurately directed onto no man's land, turned it into a killing ground. Generals on both sides were not stupid. They understood the problem, but they felt they had no choice but to attack. The war could only be won by defeating the enemy army and occupying enemy territory. Defense alone could not achieve victory. So both sides launched offensive after offensive, each time hoping that this attack, with more men, more artillery, better planning, would achieve the breakthrough. Each offensive followed the same pattern. First came days or even weeks of artillery bombardment designed to destroy enemy trenches, cut barbed wire, and kill defenders. The bombardments were spectacular. Thousands of guns would fire simultaneously, hurling millions of shells at enemy positions. The noise could be heard in England when big offensives were launched in France. The ground shook as if from an earthquake. Entire landscapes were obliterated, forests reduced to splinters, villages erased. But the bombardments rarely achieved their goals. Deep dugouts protected soldiers from all but direct hits. Much barbed wire survived, and broken wire was often worse than intact wire because it was harder to spot and more tangled. The bombardments also warned the enemy that an attack was coming, allowing them to bring up reserves. And the shell fire turned no man's land into a cratered moonscape, making it even harder for attackers to advance. After the bombardment came 0 hour, the moment when infantry went over the top, climbed out of their trenches, and advanced toward enemy lines. Officers blew whistles. Men climbed ladders and scrambled over the parapet. Then they walked or ran across no man's land toward enemy trenches. That's when defenders emerged from their dugouts, set up machine guns, and opened fire. The slaughter was methodical and industrial. Machine guns traversed back and forth, cutting down men like wheat before a scythe. Artillery fired on no man's land, each shell killing and wounding everyone within its blast radius. Soldiers fell in waves. Those who made it through the fire often found the barbed wire uncut and became trapped, easy targets. Some units lost 90% or more of their men in a single attack. The wounded lay in no man's land, crying for help that often never came. Stretcher bearers who ventured out to help them frequently became casualties themselves. If attackers did reach enemy trenches, savage hand-to-hand combat erupted. Men fought with rifles, bayonets, clubs, shovels, and grenades in confined spaces, killing at close range. The fighting was primitive and brutal. But even successful attacks that captured enemy trenches usually failed to achieve strategic results. Defenders would retreat to their support trenches, and reinforcements would counterattack before the attackers could consolidate their gains. Weeks of fighting might result in gains of a few hundred yards, at the cost of tens of thousands of casualties. Part 5. The Great Offensives. The year 1915 saw both sides launch major offensives attempting to break the deadlock. None succeeded. The fighting introduced new horrors and demonstrated that the trench stalemate was not easily broken. The Germans, having failed to knock France out of the war quickly, decided to focus on the Eastern Front in 1915 while staying defensive in the West. But in April 1915, they introduced a new weapon that would become synonymous with the war's horror: poison gas. On April 22, 1915, at Ypres in Belgium, German forces released 168 tons of chlorine gas from cylinders, creating a cloud that drifted toward French colonial troops holding the line. The gas was heavier than air and poured into the trenches. Men who breathed it felt their lungs burning. They coughed up blood and collapsed, drowning in the fluid filling their lungs. The attack created a gap in the Allied lines 4 miles wide. Thousands died or were incapacitated. But the Germans failed to fully exploit the breakthrough, partly because they feared their own gas, and partly because they lacked sufficient reserves in position. The Allies rushed reinforcements to close the gap. The moment passed. Gas had created an opportunity, but that opportunity was wasted. Both sides quickly adopted gas warfare. The British and French developed their own gas weapons. A deadly escalation followed as chemists developed new gases. Phosgene, which was more lethal than chlorine. Mustard gas, which caused terrible burns and blindness. Gas masks became standard equipment. Soldiers lived in fear of the cry, "Gas!" which meant frantically pulling on masks and hoping they worked. Gas proved to be a terrible weapon that ultimately benefited neither side. It killed and injured hundreds of thousands, but rarely achieved decisive tactical results. Wind could blow it back on those who released it. Rain could cause it to settle into trenches and linger. Masks, though uncomfortable and scary, provided reasonable protection once they were improved. Gas became just another horror in a war full of horrors, remarkable more for its cruelty than its effectiveness. The French launched their major offensive of 1915 in Artois and Champagne, attempting to break through German lines. General Joffre committed over 1 million men to attacks between May and September. The attacks followed the now standard pattern: massive artillery bombardment followed by infantry assaults. The results were equally standard: minimal territorial gains at enormous cost. France suffered approximately 150,000 casualties in these offensives. The German lines held. The British, building up their strength in France with volunteers and newly raised formations, launched their first major attack at Neuve-Chapelle in March, and followed with attacks at Augur's Ridge and Festubert in May. These attacks revealed that the British Army, though brave, was still learning the grim lessons of trench warfare. Junior officers, conspicuous in their uniforms and leading from the front, were killed in astonishing numbers. The British suffered nearly 60,000 casualties in these early 1915 offensives and achieved nothing of strategic value. The autumn of 1915 brought another major French offensive, this time at Loos. The British participated, launching 75,000 men in an attack supported by poison gas. But the wind shifted, blowing British gas back onto British troops. The attack bogged down in barbed wire and machine gun fire. British casualties exceeded 50,000. Among the dead was Rudyard Kipling's son, John, whose body was never identified, leading the famous author to write bitter poetry questioning the purpose of the war. By the end of 1915, the strategic situation was essentially unchanged on the Western Front. Hundreds of thousands had died. The trench lines had barely moved. Generals on both sides were increasingly desperate for some way to break the stalemate. That desperation would lead to even greater bloodletting in 1916. The year 1916 would see two of the war's most infamous battles, Verdun and the Somme. These battles embodied everything that was terrible about the First World War. They demonstrated industrial warfare at its most destructive. They killed men in quantities that stagger imagination. And they achieved essentially nothing. Verdun began as a deliberate German strategy to bleed France white. German Chief of General Staff Erich von Falkenhayn proposed attacking Verdun, a historic fortress city that France would feel compelled to defend for symbolic reasons. Falkenhayn calculated that by attacking Verdun, Germany would force France to commit endless reserves to its defense. Germany would then kill more French soldiers than Germany lost, gradually exhausting French manpower until France was forced to surrender. This strategy of attrition was callous and cynical, but it reflected Falkenhayn's conclusion that breakthrough was impossible. If trenches couldn't be broken, then the only way to win was to kill the enemy faster than they killed you. It was warfare reduced to arithmetic, treating human beings as numbers to be subtracted from the enemy's total strength. The attack began on February 21, 1916, with the most intense artillery bombardment yet seen. Over 1,200 German guns fired 2 million shells in just 9 hours. The bombardment destroyed French frontline positions, entombed soldiers alive, and drove survivors mad with terror. German infantry advanced confidently, expecting minimal resistance. But French defenders, though battered, fought back with desperate courage. The battle quickly devolved into a grinding slog as both sides fed more and more men into the fight. The French commander, Philippe Pétain, organized a supply route called the Sacred Way. along which trucks brought supplies and reinforcements while evacuating wounded. A French soldier might spend a week or two at Verdun, then be rotated out, only to return months later. This rotation meant that most of the French army experienced Verdun, making it a collective trauma for the nation. The battle raged for 10 months. Villages were fought over a dozen times, changing hands repeatedly until nothing remained but rubble and corpses. Forts became charnel houses. The terrain was destroyed so completely that it resembled a lunar landscape, every square meter plowed by shellfire, nothing green remaining. At Verdun, the phrase "they shall not pass" became the French rallying cry, and pass they did not. Despite losing more men than the Germans approximately, 400,000 French casualties to 350,000 German France held Verdun, but the victory was Pyrrhic. France was exhausted, its army on the verge of collapse. The human cost was staggering, with over 700,000 total casualties for both sides, for essentially no change in the strategic situation. While Verdun ground on, the British prepared their own massive offensive, the Battle of the Somme. The Somme offensive had multiple purposes: relieve pressure on Verdun by forcing Germany to divert forces, break through German lines, and demonstrate that Britain's rapidly expanding army was ready for major operations. The British assembled the largest army they had ever put in the field, with over 750,000 men preparing for the attack. The offensive was preceded by a week-long bombardment, the heaviest artillery preparation of the war to that point. From June 24th to July 1st, 1916, British guns fired over 1.5 million shells at German positions along a 20-mile front. The sound of the bombardment could be heard in London, 140 miles away. British commanders were confident the bombardment would destroy German defenses and allow their men to simply walk across no man's land and occupy enemy trenches. They were disastrously wrong. Many British shells were duds that failed to explode. The shells that did explode often failed to cut the barbed wire as intended. And German defenders, many sheltered in deep dugouts 30 feet underground, survived the bombardment. When the British bombardment ceased at 7:30 a.m. on July 1st, 1916, German soldiers emerged from their dugouts, set up machine guns, and waited. At 7:30 a.m., British officers blew their whistles. All along the line, British soldiers climbed out of their trenches and began walking toward German lines. They walked rather than ran because they carried heavy loads of equipment, about 70 pounds per man, and commanders believed walking would help maintain formation and control. The soldiers advanced in long lines, shoulder to shoulder, as if on parade. German machine gunners could hardly believe their eyes. Target after target presented itself. They simply traversed their guns back and forth, cutting down the British attackers in neat rows. It was slaughter on an industrial scale. In some sectors, entire battalions were destroyed in minutes. The attack was failing before it had barely begun, but communications were so poor that British commanders behind the lines had no idea what was happening at the front. By the end of the first day of the Somme, the British Army had suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, with almost 20,000 dead. It was the bloodiest day in British military history. Some units lost 90% of their men. The small territorial gains achieved in a few sectors were negligible compared to the cost. Yet despite this catastrophe, British commanders ordered the attack to continue. The Battle of the Somme dragged on until November 1916. Day after day, week after week, British, French, and German soldiers fought and died for tiny gains. Villages and woods became household names in Britain. Thiepval, Mametz, Delville Wood, High Wood. Each name represented thousands of casualties. New tactics and weapons were introduced. Tanks made their battlefield debut in September, though in small numbers and with limited effect. The fighting took on a quality of insane repetition. The same attacks launched again and again despite the same results. When the battle finally ended in November, the Allies had advanced about 6 miles at the deepest point. The cost was over 1 million casualties for both sides combined, approximately 420,000 British, 200,000 French, and 465,000 German. For this appalling cost, no strategic objectives had been achieved. The German lines remained intact. The breakthrough had not occurred. The Somme broke something in the British psyche. The army that fought there was not the small professional force of 1914, but Kitchener's new army, volunteers who had enlisted in 1914 and 1915 with patriotic enthusiasm. These were the flower of British youth, university students, athletes, artists, poets, businessmen, workers. They went into battle confident and brave. They were slaughtered. The Somme became a synonym for futility and waste. One poet, John Masefield, tried to make sense of the battle's purpose, writing that the men had not died in vain because their sacrifice had weakened Germany. But survivors like Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen wrote bitter poetry, questioning whether any purpose could justify such slaughter. Sassoon's poem, Suicide in the Trenches, condemned those safe at home who glorified war without understanding its reality. While the Western Front saw these enormous battles achieving nothing, fighting raged elsewhere with equally terrible consequences. In Italy, which had entered the war on the Allied side in May 1915, Italian and Austrian forces fought a series of battles along the mountainous border. These battles, known as the Battles of the Isonzo, were fought in some of the worst terrain imaginable: high mountains, deep valleys, winter snow, summer heat. 11 separate battles were fought along the Isonzo River between June 1915 and September 1917, resulting in over 1 million casualties from minimal territorial change. Fighting in the mountains was particularly awful, with men struggling to haul artillery up slopes, dig trenches in rock, and survive in winter conditions. In the Middle East, British forces suffered a humiliating defeat at Kut in Mesopotamia in April 1916. Over 13,000 British and Indian troops surrendered to Ottoman forces after a siege that lasted 147 days. It was one of Britain's worst defeats, made more painful by the fact that relief attempts had failed, and the besieged garrison had been reduced to eating horses and even their leather equipment. But the Middle East would also see one of the war's most romantic episodes, the Arab Revolt. In June 1916, Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, proclaimed a revolt against Ottoman rule. The British supported the revolt, seeing it as a way to undermine the Ottoman Empire and protect British interests in Egypt and the Persian Gulf. A young British officer, T.E. Lawrence, served as liaison to the Arab forces and helped organize their campaigns. Lawrence of Arabia, as he became known, led Arab irregulars in a guerrilla campaign against the Ottomans. The Arabs specialized in raids against the Hejaz Railway, the vital supply line connecting Damascus to Medina. These raids tied down Ottoman forces and contributed to Britain's eventual conquest of Palestine and Syria. Lawrence promised the Arabs independence after the war, promises that would be betrayed when Britain and France divided the Middle East between themselves in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. That betrayal would poison Middle Eastern politics for the next century. Part 6: Revolution, Mutiny, and America. The year 1917 began with all combatants exhausted. The enormous battles of 1916 had achieved nothing decisive. Casualties were staggering. Economies were strained. Civilian populations were weary, yet no end was in sight. The war had become a test of endurance. Which side would collapse first? Russia would provide the answer. Russia had entered the war with enormous manpower but poor logistics, inadequate supplies, and often incompetent leadership. Russian soldiers fought bravely, but they were sent into battle without enough rifles, ammunition, or boots. Russian generals launched offensives with little regard for casualties. By 1917, Russia had suffered over 4 million military casualties. The Russian economy was near collapse. Bread riots were common, and the Tsar, Nicholas II, bore the blame for all of it. In March 1917, bread riots in Petrograd, the capital, sparked a revolution. Women marched through the streets demanding bread. Workers went on strike. When soldiers were ordered to fire on protesters, they refused and joined the uprising instead. Within days, the Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for 3 centuries, collapsed. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated on March 15, 1917, ending autocratic rule. A provisional government took power, composed mainly of liberal politicians who wanted to transform Russia into a Western-style democracy while continuing the war effort. The provisional government's fatal mistake was deciding to continue the war. Russia needed peace, land reform, and food. The provisional government offered speeches and elections. This created an opening for more radical forces. Vladimir Lenin, leader of the Bolshevik Party, had been living in exile in Switzerland. The Germans, hoping to knock Russia out of the war, provided Lenin safe passage through Germany to Russia in a sealed train. Lenin arrived at the Finland station in Petrograd in April 1917 with a simple message: peace, land, and bread. The Bolsheviks would end the war, give land to peasants, and feed the cities. It was a message that resonated powerfully with a war-weary population. The provisional government staggered on through the summer, launching one last offensive in June 1917 that briefly gained ground before collapsing into retreat and mutiny. Soldiers deserted by the thousands. Officers were murdered by their own men. The Russian army was disintegrating. On November 7, 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power in a nearly bloodless coup. Red Guards occupied key buildings in Petrograd. The provisional government fell without significant resistance. Lenin immediately issued decrees calling for peace and land redistribution. In December, the Bolsheviks opened peace negotiations with Germany. In March 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, surrendering vast territories to German control: Poland, Ukraine, Finland, the Baltic states, and portions of the Caucasus. The terms were humiliating, but Lenin accepted them because he needed peace to consolidate Bolshevik power and because he believed world revolution would soon make the treaty irrelevant. Russia's exit from the war was catastrophic for the Allies. Germany could now transfer millions of men from the Eastern Front to the West for a final offensive, before American power could tip the balance. But Russia's exit also removed a despotic regime, and the Russian Revolution inspired left-wing movements worldwide, including mutinies and strikes among other combatants. France nearly collapsed in 1917. The war had bled France terribly. Every French family had lost someone. The country was exhausted. And in April 1917, the French army launched yet another offensive that promised breakthrough, but delivered only more slaughter. General Robert Nivelle had convinced the French government that he had discovered the secret to breaking the German lines. He would launch a massive attack on the Chemin des Dames Ridge with overwhelming force and breakthrough in 48 hours. The attack began on April 16, 1917. It was a disaster. German defenses held. The attack gained little ground at enormous cost. Within days, it was clear Nivelle's promises were empty. Within weeks, French casualties exceeded 100,000. The French army had reached its breaking point. Starting in May 1917, mutinies spread through French units. Soldiers refused to attack, but generally remained willing to defend. They were not cowards, and they were not deserting. They were simply saying they would no longer participate in suicidal attacks. At its peak, the mutiny affected 54 divisions, over half the French army. The mutiny was kept remarkably secret. German intelligence never learned the full extent of the crisis. French commanders responded with a combination of repression and reform. About 3,400 soldiers were court-martialed and 554 sentenced to death, though only about 49 were actually executed. But new commander Philippe Pétain also instituted reforms: better food, more leave, better medical care, and a promise of no more pointless offensives. Gradually, morale recovered. The mutiny subsided. But France was essentially out of offensive action for the rest of 1917. Italy suffered a catastrophic defeat in October 1917. Austrian and German forces attacked at Caporetto and shattered Italian lines. Italian troops fled in panic. Over 300,000 were captured. The defeat was so complete that Italy nearly withdrew from the war. Only frantic Allied reinforcements and a successful defense along the Piave River prevented complete collapse. Britain and Germany fought brutal battles in Flanders in 1917. The Third Battle of Ypres, better known as Passchendaele, lasted from July to November. British forces attacked German positions in some of the worst conditions imaginable. Constant rain turned the battlefield into a swamp. Shell craters filled with water deep enough to drown in. Men who slipped off the duckboard paths sank into mud and drowned slowly, unable to be rescued. Entire divisions advanced a few hundred yards through this hellscape at costs of thousands of casualties per day. When Passchendaele finally ended, the British had advanced about 5 miles and suffered 325,000 casualties. The name Passchendaele became synonymous with pointless slaughter, rivaling the Somme for its horror. The British poet Siegfried Sassoon called his commanding officers callous and incompetent, articulating what many soldiers felt but dared not say. Amid all this darkness, one event offered hope for the Allies: America's entry into the war. The United States had remained neutral since 1914, despite increasing economic and emotional ties to Britain and France. President Woodrow Wilson, a former professor and idealist, had tried to mediate peace. He won re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But Germany made a decision that would prove fatal to its war effort. In January 1917, Germany announced it would resume unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking all ships in waters around Britain without warning. Germany's leaders calculated that submarines could starve Britain into surrender within 6 months, before America could mobilize its potential strength. American opinion turned decisively against Germany. Unrestricted submarine warfare threatened American ships and lives. Then British intelligence provided an explosive revelation: the Zimmermann telegram. German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann had sent a secret telegram to Mexico proposing a military alliance. If America entered the war, Mexico should attack the United States. In return, Germany would help Mexico recover Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The telegram was intercepted and decoded by British intelligence, then handed to the Americans. When the Zimmermann telegram was published in American newspapers in March 1917, public outrage exploded. The telegram confirmed German hostility to American interests. Combined with submarine warfare, which had already sunk several American ships, it made continued neutrality impossible. On April 2, 1917, President Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war. In a speech that would echo through history, Wilson said, "The world must be made safe for democracy." He promised this would be the war to end all wars. On April 6, 1917, America entered the First World War. American entry provided an enormous psychological boost to the exhausted Allies. American manpower and industrial might would eventually tip the balance. But translating American potential into battlefield strength would take time. The U.S. Army numbered only about 200,000 men in 1917, smaller than Romania's army. America would need to raise, train, equip, and transport millions of soldiers across an ocean patrolled by submarines. General John J. Pershing took command of the American Expeditionary Force. A tough, competent officer, Pershing insisted that American forces would fight as a unified American army under American command, not be parceled out as replacements for British and French units. This caused friction with Allied commanders who were desperate for fresh troops, but Pershing stood firm. America instituted conscription in May 1917. Over the next year, millions of men would be drafted, trained, and shipped to France. American industry geared up for war production. American farms increased output to feed the Allies. American banks financed Allied purchases. America was becoming what Wilson called the arsenal of democracy. But this would all take time. And time was something the Allies did not have much of. With Russia out of the war and France exhausted, Germany saw a window of opportunity. In the spring of 1918, before American strength could arrive in force, Germany would launch one final offensive to win the war. Part 7. The Final Year. By March 1918, Germany had transferred over 1 million men from the Eastern Front to the West. For the first time since 1914, Germany had numerical superiority on the Western Front. Erich Ludendorff, effectively Germany's military dictator, planned a series of massive offensives to break through Allied lines and win the war before American strength could tip the balance. It was Germany's last chance, and Ludendorff knew it. The Germans had developed new tactics based on lessons learned from years of trench warfare. Instead of advancing in rigid lines, they would use small groups of elite stormtroopers armed with light machine guns, grenades, and flamethrowers. These stormtroopers would infiltrate enemy lines, bypass strong points, and push deep into the rear areas, causing confusion and collapse. Artillery would fire short, intense bombardments rather than prolonged bombardments that warned of attack. Poison gas would be used extensively to neutralize defenders. Operation Michael, the first German offensive, was launched on March 21, 1918, against British positions near the Somme. The attack began at 4:40 a.m. with a Chirurgisch bombardment by over 6,000 guns, firing high explosive and gas shells. Fog blanketed the battlefield, providing cover for the German stormtroopers who advanced through the mist like ghosts. British positions were overrun. Communications collapsed. Entire divisions were destroyed or captured. Within days, the Germans had advanced 40 miles, the greatest movement on the Western Front since 1914. British commanders were close to panic. Field Marshal Douglas Haig issued a famous order to his troops. With our backs to the wall and believing in the justice of our cause, each one of us must fight on to the end. The situation was desperate. German forces had driven a wedge between British and French armies and threatened to reach the Channel coast, cutting British forces off from their supply bases. But the German advance was reaching its limits. Stormtroopers had advanced so quickly that they outran their supplies and artillery support. German soldiers, many half-starved due to the British blockade, stopped to loot British supply dumps, gorging on food and drink. Discipline broke down. The offensive lost momentum. Allied reinforcements arrived. By early April, Operation Michael had ground to a halt. Germany had advanced significantly, but had not achieved a breakthrough. Worse, Germany had suffered over 250,000 casualties, losses it could not afford. Ludendorff launched 3 more major offensives over the next 3 months. Operation Georgette in April in Flanders, the Third Battle of the Aisne in May, and the Champagne-Marne offensive in July. Each offensive initially succeeded, driving the Allies back. Each time, the Germans came tantalizingly close to a decisive breakthrough. In late May, German forces once again reached the Marne River, just 40 miles from Paris. For the second time in the war, the French government prepared to evacuate the capital. But each offensive exhausted itself. German casualties mounted to over 900,000 by mid-1918. These were irreplaceable losses of Germany's best remaining troops. The Allies, though battered, were receiving massive American reinforcements. But each offensive exhausted itself. German casualties mounted to over 900,000 by mid-1918. These were irreplaceable losses of Germany's best remaining troops. The Allies, though battered, were receiving massive American reinforcements. By summer 1918, American soldiers were arriving in France at a rate of 250,000 per month. Over 2 million American troops would eventually serve in France. The balance of power was shifting decisively against Germany. American troops saw their first major action at Belleau Wood in June 1918. The U.S. Marine Corps fought German forces in a dense forest, engaging in close-quarters combat of extraordinary intensity. The Marines suffered heavy casualties, but eventually captured the position, proving that American forces could fight effectively. A French officer reportedly said, "The Americans may not make war as we do, but they certainly know how to fight." On July 15, 1918, Germany launched its final offensive, the Second Battle of the Marne. This time, the Allies were ready. French intelligence had learned of the attack in advance. When German forces attacked, they ran into prepared defenses. The offensive was stopped in its tracks. 3 days later, French forces counterattacked with American support. The German line broke. For the first time since 1914, German forces were in full retreat. August 8, 1918, became what Ludendorff called the Black Day of the German Army. Allied forces, spearheaded by Canadian and Australian troops, supported by over 400 tanks and overwhelming air superiority, attacked near Amiens. German defenses collapsed. Thousands of German soldiers surrendered without serious resistance. More ominously, retreating German troops called advancing reserves blacklegs and strike breakers, indicating that morale was breaking. German soldiers were no longer willing to die for a lost cause. The 100 Days offensive had begun. For the next 3 months, Allied forces pushed German armies back across France and Belgium. This was not a continuous advance, but a series of carefully planned attacks at different points of the front, preventing Germans from concentrating their defenses. The Allies used tanks en masse, employed aircraft for ground attack and tactical bombing, and coordinated infantry, artillery, and armor in combined arms operations that foreshadowed modern warfare. German forces fought skillfully, conducting fighting retreats and counterattacks, but they could not stop the Allied advance. Germany's allies were collapsing. Bulgaria signed an armistice in late September after Allied forces broke through in the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire, defeated by British forces in Palestine and Mesopotamia, sued for peace in October. Austria-Hungary, its army disintegrating and its empire fracturing along ethnic lines, signed an armistice on November 3rd. Germany now stood alone, and Germany was falling apart. The Allied blockade had starved the German home front for 4 years. By 1918, Germans were subsisting on turnips and ersatz coffee made from acorns. Malnutrition weakened the population, making them vulnerable to the Spanish flu pandemic that was sweeping the world. Hundreds of thousands of German civilians would die from starvation-related causes and disease during and immediately after the war. The German military situation was hopeless. American troops were pouring into France faster than Germany could replace losses. Allied artillery and tanks dominated the battlefield. German forces were being pushed back toward Germany's borders. Ludendorff, who had been so confident in March, now suffered a nervous breakdown. He advised the Kaiser that Germany must seek an armistice before the army completely collapsed. Revolution erupted in Germany. The German Navy, ordered to sortie for a final desperate battle against the British, mutinied. Sailors refused to obey orders and raised red flags over their ships. The mutiny spread to ports, then to cities. Workers went on strike. Soldiers and workers' councils formed, echoing the Russian Revolution. Germany was on the verge of collapse. Kaiser Wilhelm II, who had ruled Germany since 1888 and whose aggressive policies had contributed to the war's outbreak, abdicated on November 9, 1918, and fled to neutral Holland. A republic was proclaimed in Berlin. Germany's new civilian government immediately opened negotiations for an armistice. The armistice terms were harsh. Germany must evacuate all occupied territories, surrender vast amounts of military equipment, including all submarines, and accept Allied occupation of the Rhineland. German negotiators protested that these terms were not an armistice but a surrender, but they had no choice. The German army could not continue fighting. At 5 a.m. on November 11, 1918, in a railway car in the forest of Compiègne in northern France, German representatives signed the armistice agreement. The ceasefire would take effect at 11 a.m. the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. As 11 a.m. approached, soldiers on both sides waited, watching their watches. Some fighting continued right up to the deadline. Tragically, some soldiers were killed in the final minutes of the war, dying for objectives that would be meaningless in hours. An American soldier, Henry Gunther, was killed charging a German machine gun position at 10:59 a.m., 1 minute before the armistice. He is often cited as the last soldier killed in the war, though others died in the same final minutes. At exactly 11 a.m., the guns fell silent. After 4 years, 3 months, and 1 week of continuous fighting, the Great War was over. In trenches across the Western Front, an eerie silence descended. Men who had lived with constant noise for years suddenly heard birds singing. The silence was almost disorienting. Soldiers reacted to the armistice in different ways. Some celebrated wildly, firing guns into the air, cheering, crying with relief. Others sat quietly, too exhausted and traumatized to celebrate. Many simply couldn't believe the war was really over. After so many years of horror, peace seemed almost impossible. Some soldiers later said they felt more sorrow than joy, thinking of the millions who had died and would never experience this moment. In cities across the Allied nations, news of the armistice triggered celebrations. In London, Paris, and New York, crowds poured into the streets, waving flags, singing, dancing. Strangers embraced. Church bells rang. The nightmare was finally over. But the celebration was tinged with grief. Every family had lost someone. Every town had its roll of dead. The joy of victory could not erase the pain of loss. In Germany, the mood was very different. Germans felt not relief, but shock and betrayal. The German army had fought magnificently and was still occupying foreign territory when the armistice was signed. Many Germans could not believe their army had been defeated. This gave rise to the stab in the back legend, the false claim that Germany's army had not been defeated militarily, but had been betrayed by civilians, socialists, and Jews on the home front. This poisonous myth would contribute to the rise of Nazism in the 1920s and 1930s. The human cost of the First World War is almost impossible to comprehend. Approximately 17 million people died, 10 million military personnel, and 7 million civilians. France lost 1.4 million men, roughly 10% of its male population. Britain and its empire lost nearly 1 million. Germany lost 2 million. Russia's losses exceeded 3 million from combat, with millions more dying in the subsequent civil war. Austria-Hungary lost over 1 million. Italy lost 650,000. The United States, which fought for only 19 months, lost 116,000 men, about half from combat and half from disease, particularly the Spanish flu. These numbers represent individual tragedies multiplied millions of times. Behind each statistic was a person someone's son, husband, father, brother. Entire communities lost their young men. France had regions where every male between the ages of 18 and 40 was killed. Britain had lost generation universities, with a majority of students never returned. Villages across Europe erected war memorials listing names that represented most of the community's young men. The wounded numbered over 21 million. Many suffered from terrible injuries, amputations, blindness, disfigurement. The broken faces of men whose faces had been destroyed by shells became a haunting symbol of the war. Plastic surgery developed rapidly during and after the war, attempting to reconstruct faces and give men back some semblance of normality. Artificial limbs were manufactured by the hundreds of thousands. Veterans with visible injuries were a common sight in every city and town for decades after the war. Psychological trauma was nearly universal among those who served at the front. Shell shock, combat fatigue, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, hundreds of thousands of men suffered from nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, depression, and other symptoms. Many could never readjust to civilian life. Suicide rates among veterans were high. The psychological scars of the war would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. Entire regions of France and Belgium were rendered uninhabitable. The Zone Rouge, the Red Zone, covered over 1,200 square kilometers of land, so contaminated with unexploded ordnance, poison gas, and human remains that it was declared unfit for human habitation. Some areas remain restricted to this day, over a century later. Even now, farmers in former battle zones regularly uncover shells, bones, and other remnants of the war. Several people are killed each year by unexploded ordnance from World War I. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 1919, spread by troop movements and gatherings, killed at least 50 million people worldwide, far more than the war itself. The pandemic affected every continent and killed healthy young adults at higher rates than children and the elderly, making it particularly devastating. The war's disruption of healthcare and the weakening of populations through malnutrition contributed to the pandemic's severity. The guns had fallen silent, but the peacemaking was just beginning. In January 1919, representatives of 32 nations gathered in Paris for the peace conference that would redraw the map of the world. The conference was dominated by the Big Four: President Woodrow Wilson of the United States, Prime Minister David Lloyd George of Britain, Premier Georges Clemenceau of France, and Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando of Italy. These men brought different visions of what peace should look like. Wilson arrived with his 14 points, an idealistic plan for a just peace based on self-determination, open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, disarmament, and a League of Nations to prevent future wars. Wilson believed the war had been caused by secret alliances, imperialism, and lack of democracy. A new international order based on liberal principles would prevent future conflicts. Clemenceau, the aged French premier known as the Tiger, wanted security and revenge. France had been invaded twice by Germany, in living memory, in 1870 and 1914. Clemenceau wanted Germany permanently weakened, stripped of territory, and forced to pay for the damage it had caused. He famously said of Wilson's 14 points, "The good Lord only had 10. Lloyd George occupied a middle position. Britain wanted Germany weakened, but not destroyed, as a strong Germany was needed to balance French power on the continent. Britain wanted to preserve its naval supremacy, maintain its empire, and ensure that Germany's colonial possessions were distributed to Britain and its dominions. The Paris Peace Conference produced several treaties, the most important being the Treaty of Versailles with Germany, signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. The treaty was harsh. Germany lost all its colonies, 13% of its European territory, and 10% of its population. The industrial regions of Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. The Rhineland was demilitarized and occupied by Allied forces. The German army was limited to 100,000 men with no tanks, aircraft, submarines, or heavy artillery. The German Navy was reduced to a token force. Most controversially, Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for causing the war. This provided legal justification for massive reparations payments to cover Allied war costs. The exact reparations figure was not set in the treaty, but would be determined later, eventually reaching 132 billion gold marks, an astronomical sum that Germany could not possibly pay. The Treaty of Versailles satisfied no one. Germans felt humiliated and betrayed. The treaty was harsh enough to generate massive resentment, but not harsh enough to permanently prevent German resurgence. French Marshal Ferdinand Foch prophetically declared, "This is not peace. It is an armistice for 20 years." He was correct almost to the month World War II would begin in September 1939. The map of Europe was redrawn. 4 great empires had collapsed: the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires. From their ruins emerged new nations. Poland reappeared on the map after 123 years of partition among Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were created as multinational states, uniting various ethnic groups. The Baltic states Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania gained independence from Russia. Finland also broke free from Russian control. The Middle East was divided between British and French mandates, essentially colonies disguised under League of Nations supervision. Britain took control of Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan. France took Syria and Lebanon. The borders drawn by colonial officials, with little regard for ethnic, religious, or tribal divisions, created conflicts that persist to this day. The promises made to Arab leaders during the war were broken, creating lasting bitterness toward the West. The League of Nations was established, the world's first international organization dedicated to maintaining peace. But the League had fatal weaknesses. The United States never joined. The Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles and American membership in the League. Without American participation, the League lacked the power to enforce its decisions. Germany and Russia were initially excluded. The League had no army and depended on member states to enforce sanctions. When tested in the 1930s by Japanese, Italian, and German aggression, the League proved toothless. The First World War shattered the optimistic belief in inevitable progress that had characterized the 19th century. The war demonstrated that industrial civilization could produce death and destruction on previously unimaginable scales. The faith in reason, science, and human goodness that had seemed so solid in 1914 lay in ruins by 1918. Politically, the war destroyed the old order. Monarchies fell across Europe, replaced by democracies, dictatorships, and communist states. The Russian Revolution inspired communist movements worldwide and created the Soviet Union, which would be one of the 20th century's dominant powers. The war's hardships and the perception that old elites had failed led to political radicalization. Fascism, which glorified the nation and the state while rejecting democracy and individual rights, emerged in Italy under Mussolini and would later triumph in Germany under Hitler. The war accelerated women's suffrage. Women's contributions to the war, effort working in factories, serving as nurses, maintaining civilian life, while men fought made denying them the vote increasingly untenable. Many nations extended voting rights to women during or shortly after the war. Britain in 1918, Germany in 1919, the United States in 1920. The war transformed art and literature. The horror and senselessness of the war inspired works of bitter disillusionment. Poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon wrote of the war's reality in verses that rejected romantic notions of glorious combat. Owen's Dulci et decorum est attacked the old Latin saying, It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country, as the old lie. Eric Maria Remarque's novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, became the definitive German account of the war's horror. Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms captured American disillusionment. Artists like Otto Dix painted nightmarish images of war's trauma. Economically, the war bankrupted Europe. Britain and France owed enormous debts to the United States. Germany owed impossible reparations to the Allies. The interwar period would be marked by economic instability, inflation, and depression, culminating in the global economic catastrophe of the 1930s that contributed to World War II. The First World War did not end all wars. It made future wars more likely. The Treaty of Versailles left Germany humiliated and resentful, creating conditions for the rise of Hitler. The war's disruption of European society created space for extremist movements. The war's failure to resolve underlying tensions ensured they would erupt again. In many ways, the Second World War was a continuation of the First, the unfinished business of 1918. The men who fought the war tried to find meaning in their suffering. They told themselves they had fought to end all wars, to make the world safe for democracy, to defend civilization. Some veterans embraced these narratives, finding comfort in the belief their sacrifice had served a noble purpose. Others became bitter pacifists, convinced that the war had been a pointless catastrophe, engineered by incompetent leaders and serving no good purpose. Still others refused to speak of the war at all, carrying their trauma silently to their graves. As the years passed and veterans aged, the First World War became history rather than lived experience. The lost generation that fought the war gradually died off. The last veteran of World War I, Florence Green, who had served in Britain's Women's Royal Air Force, died in 2012 at age 110. With her death, the war passed entirely from living memory into history. Today, over a century after the guns fell silent, the First World War's legacy remains with us. The borders it drew, the nations it created, the hatreds it spawned, the technologies it developed, all continue to shape our world. The Middle East's conflicts, the tensions of modern Europe, the memory of industrial warfare's horror, all trace back to 1914 to 1918. Perhaps the war's most important legacy is the determination that such horror must never be repeated. Never again became the rallying cry. The League of Nations failed, but after World War II, the United Nations succeeded it, attempting once more to prevent global conflict. The European Union emerged from a desire to so intertwine European nations economically that war between them would become impossible. NATO provided collective security without the rigid alliances that had made World War I spread so quickly. The war memorials in every town, the ceremonies on November 11th, the preserved battlefields and cemeteries, all serve to remember the fallen and remind us of war's cost. When we see the rows of white crosses at Thiepval or Tyne Cot, when we read the names on memorials of those who have no known grave, when we reflect on 17 million dead and 21 million wounded, we are forced to confront what human beings are capable of doing to each other. The First World War was called the Great War by those who lived through it, not because it was admirable, but because of its terrible scale. It was called the war to end all wars, not because it actually ended war, but because those who experienced it hoped desperately that humanity would never again inflict such suffering upon itself. They were tragically wrong, but their hope was not misplaced. If we remember what happened in those 4 terrible years, if we understand how civilization stumbled into catastrophe, if we honor the memory of those who suffered and died, perhaps we can work to ensure that the Great War's bitter lessons are not forgotten and its horrors are not repeated. This has been the story of the First World War, a story of how the modern world was born in blood and fire, of how millions suffered and died, of how empires fell and new nations rose, of how humanity faced its darkest hour and somehow survived. May we never forget, and may we always strive to ensure that such a war never happens again.